I have helped the Chinese towards a more intimate connection with the West, and of preservation thereby of peace and better understanding. I have aided them in many troubles, internal and external, and have been of use to them in the settlement of many questions, and by the giving of much good advice. Thus, publicly and officially, I think I may lay claim to have done something for my fellows and the world.
In a quiet village churchyard in Bisham near London, preparations are taking place to restore the grave of an Irishman world famous in his lifetime but now virtually forgotten. Sir Robert Hart was head of the Chinese Maritime Customs from the age of just 29 until his death in 1911. Appointed and employed by the Imperial Chinese government, Hart led the development of Chinese trade for 48 years, from the middle of the 19th century until the dawn of the 20th century. Under his influence, China built the infrastructure which was to establish the country as an emerging regional power and a modern trading nation.
If you want to understand the British story in China, you have to understand Robert Hart's contribution to it.
Robert Hart was seen as the most trustworthy and senior advisor for the Qing government. They referred to Hart as our friend Hart.
He is the most famous Irish person in the world, but nobody in Ireland knows about him. There must be something wrong about that.
Robert Hart may have been largely forgotten in Ireland and Britain, but he is still remembered in China.
Robert Hart's legacy is a controversial one. In China, he is still seen within the history of British imperialist aggression against China.
The question of Hart's loyalty has often been queried by Chinese in general. And until recently, Hart was described as an agent of British imperialism in Chinese school textbooks.
那么这一段历史呢，对中国人来说呢，是一段屈辱的回忆。所以呢，那么以前呢，就是对他的负面的这个评价呢比较多。
Hart himself was always aware of his peculiar situation, a British subject working for the Chinese imperial court.
How odd, if true, that they really look upon me, who pray I am liked and trusted, with suspicion and dislike, and yet how natural. We've dragged them into 2 wars, burnt their palace and played the mischief everywhere. We have been the leaders in all acts of violence, and yet the loudest talkers about humanity.
And as we restore his gravestone, I think we're not restoring Robert Hart to an iconic place in Chinese history. What we're doing is saying, let's pull away all of these growths which have obscured him. Let's go back and look afresh at this man, warts and all. And let's just think about its role in the very complex relations between Britain and China.
Back in his native Ireland at Queen's University, Belfast, there is a unique archive of Hart material, including 77 journals covering 57 years, from the first day working in China to a few days before he died. There are also nearly 7,000 letters and hundreds of photographs. This rare archive of official and personal papers is now helping historians understand a difficult period of British-Chinese relations.
Robert Hart was a workaholic. He worked standing up at his desk in the inspectorate, reading reports, commentating on them, sending letters and instructions and tickings off to men in far-off posts.
The story begins during the First Opium War of 1839. Opium was illegal in China due to the disastrous social and physical effects that followed addiction. But the drug remained popular. British private traders bought opium in Bengal from the East India Company and smuggled it into China using small junks. The silver they earned as a result was used to buy tea and imported back to Britain in fast clipper ships. In 1839, the Chinese hit back, blockading the Europeans into their enclave in Canton and confiscating 20,000 cases of opium. But the British government resented this affront to its power and dignity and seized the opportunity to try and open up trade in China much more widely. With their new steamships and modern guns, British victory, though hard won, was inevitable.
中国清政府当时签订了一系列不平等条约，被迫开放口岸。
Under the Treaty of Nanjing, 5 ports were open to British trade and residence. The most important of them was Shanghai.
They lived outside the Chinese walled city, and they built themselves a little slice of England here. And over the next 5, 6, 7 decades, thousands of foreigners eventually came to live here. A real bustling town, city grew up here.
While Shanghai prospered, war within China rumbled on as the Qing armies fought a bloody war against a powerful Christian cult, the Taiping Heavenly Sect.
Britain remains neutral initially during the Taiping Rebellion, but they also are trying to use this moment of upheaval to extend British trade, because the colonies in India were also not very stable. So lots of things happening at the same time. America is, of course, moving towards the Civil War, so that's not stable either. So around the world, as in China, especially China, is very disorderly, and the Taiping Rebellion in the end will cost 30–40 million lives.
In 1854, when Robert Hart arrived in China, he was a young man at the beginning of a career in the British consular service.
And that itself is an interesting story, because the consular service had been sort of a place where you put people who you didn't really want at home, rather eccentric aristocrats or really people who were very corrupt. But the British Foreign Office was beginning to sort of gentrify the consular service.
Hart had been a brilliant student. He had attended Queen's College University in Belfast when he was just 15, emerging 3 years later as the star student of his year, with a gift for modern languages.
Commenced my Chinese studies this morning. It is strange at first to sit with a man who does not speak a word of English, and of whose language you are equally ignorant. I got the names of several objects from him, and some 2 or 3 phrases. Some of his sounds remind me of the way you would speak to a horse. In fact, I could not put any English words together to represent them.
Earlier generation of British people in China learned Chinese from missionaries, with the purpose being to evangelize. They imbibe a certain haughty, dismissive attitude towards the Chinese, who are clearly heathens.
Hart struck up a close relationship with his Chinese colleagues, particularly one official, Wensi Eng.
And they end up talking to each other about principles, morals, stories. And one of the first things that Hart does is give Wenxiang a Chinese translation of Aesop's fables, which he then realizes, because he knows Chinese literature, what the Chinese like to read. That's the kind of stuff they would actually find amusing to read.
As well as developing an intimate knowledge of Chinese language and culture, Hart also learnt about war from diplomat and adventurer Sir Harry Parkes.
You can think of the British story as one of war and opium trading and aggression, and that is the story of Harry Parkes. And Robert Hart worked with Harry Parkes during the British and French occupation of Canton during the Second Opium War, which was a dreadful affair. There was a Chinese insurgency against the British and French, and atrocities committed by both sides. So Robert Hart saw the British enterprise in China at its worst.
This morning at 11 o'clock, 4 French sailors belonging to the Catinat were attacked by 30 or 40 braves when strolling through Navy and Collier streets, just outside Navy Gate. One of them was standing at the door of the cook shop, lighting his pipe when he was knocked down by a man in the guise of a porter. The other 3 French managed to make their escape. A party of police went out with them and found the headless body of the poor sailor outside the Yongtsing Mun. The body was almost hacked to pieces, the head gone and almost severed from the arms. The consequence was that 50 Chinese were shot near the gate. The body of the sailor was buried at sunset in the park behind the Yamen.
He sees what actually imperialism means on the ground in Canton and in Beijing, going against all the liberal principles that Robert Hart has imbibed and learned, as well as, I think, just Christianity. And if this is sort of Christianity abroad, then it looks rather ugly and terrible.
His experiences of the Second Opium War and sensitivity towards Chinese culture soon drew the attention of Prince Kung from the royal family of the Qing, as he looked for a new Inspector General for the Imperial Maritime Customs Service.
Robert Hart was a bicultural actor. He could work equally well with stuffy British diplomats and highly well-educated and cultured Chinese leading officials.
But so you can see from the Qing's perspective, to find somebody like Robert Hart who is able to talk Chinese, that's very important, and shows himself respectful to Manchu officials, there's an opportunity not to be missed.
So in 1863, at the age of only 29, Hart became one of the most powerful foreigners in China, with the task of collecting customs tax for a Qing empire that was seriously weakened by war.
There's no more important institution in the history of relations between China and the West than the maritime customs. It was always much more than a customs service. It built the infrastructure for foreign trade with China. It helped develop harbours, it built lighthouses. But more than that, it helped the Chinese state recover from the Great Taiping Rebellion and the Second Opium War with Britain and France, because it collected an immense amount of revenue.
I started from home nearly 10 years ago to commence life with an appointment for which I had none to thank but myself, my determined, patient plodding at school and at college, of some £170 a year, allowing for deductions. I now have £4,000 a year, could get as much more, I believe, as I liked. I'm independent and I'm chief of the service. Not a bit proud I am. I am more conscious of defects.
For Hart, only one thing was missing.
It would be a wonderfully good thing for me if I were married. But confound it, I can't. I shall not be able to get home until 1867. So I must wait 3 years more for a wife, unless I send home and ask him to choose one for me. Such a thing would be rather hazardous. Heaven knows what she may turn out to be.
Although he yearned for a wife, Hart's personal life was already complex.
Like all young foreign men in China, Robert Hart had a China girl, a Chinese girlfriend.
This lady's name was Ah Yao. Hart's relationship with Ah Yao lasted about 8 or 9 years. Ah Yao gave Hart 3 children, 1 girl, 2 boys.
It would be nice to know more about her, but at some point, the family destroyed some of his diaries. And I think this is the period of their great love affair.
He wanted to do well, and he thought perhaps the best thing for him to do was to marry to a woman from his own culture.
He went back to Northern Ireland to get himself a wife. Before he went, he made a settlement with Ah Yao, gave her a sum of money, and she lived the rest of her life, as far as we know, down in Macau or Canton.
Perhaps from Ah Yao, he managed to see the real inner beauty of Chinese women.
Hart sent his children to England to be educated and returned to his family home in Northern Ireland.
The girl died quite young, but the 2 boys we know then emigrated to Canada.
The Methodism into which he was born was a faith that set very high standards on living a moral life. They would have worried about things like, is it appropriate to use a tram on a Sunday? They were amongst the first of all the religious bodies to send a resolution to Parliament objecting to the slave trade of any kind. And it's possible that Robert Hart's own attitudes to the Chinese were much more enlightened than some of his contemporaries.
During his brief visit home, he met Hester Breeden, like Hart, a Methodist from Portadown. After a brief courtship, they married just 3 months later.
She is an intelligent, lively, wide-awake lassie. I just wish I was quietly back in Peking with her. I shall do all I can to make her happy and comfortable. If the past could only be blotted out.
The marriage, although it brought 3 more children for Hart, also brought unhappiness for them both, as he tried to forget Ayao.
He was distant. I don't think his relationship with his wife was a warm one. I think she found it very hard, impossible really, to cope with life in China.
After living in China for a short time, in fact, lived most of the rest of the time in England. And he rarely went back to England. So he was in Beijing until 1908 on his own.
On the one hand, he wanted to stick to his principles, but on the other hand, he often recorded that he was quite lonely and he missed the female companionship. I think this kind of missing female companionship probably still lasts later on in his life.
The battle between his Methodist conscience and the failure of his personal life became a driving force behind his work.
That's the theory behind the Protestant work ethic. How do you know that you dwell in God's favor? You don't know, but one of the signs is that God will prosper you.
This work ethic drove Hart on as he threw himself back into his new job at the customs.
I must whip the Foreign Inspectorate into shape, getting good commissioners, good office men, and seeing that all do their work properly. The duties must be properly collected, office work must be properly performed. The merchant not only must have no cause to grumble against the customs, but must be assisted. His business must be facilitated, and in that way increased. An increase of business will in the end swell the imperial coffers.
Customs revenue was vital for the Qing to recover from war and assist them in their self-strengthening movement.
In this movement, a lot of new ideas, technologies were introduced to China to improve the country. But the fact was, Qing government itself didn't really have a lot of knowledge about this kind of new program. So they relied heavily on foreign advisors.
For the Qing dynasty, faced with the fact that you have the British and the French being so enormously powerful, and that your armies are gone, and that your navy is gone, and to have an institution like the customs service that is actually in the end under your control, fine.
But Hart's new role also suited Britain.
They could not really colonize China. It was too difficult, too much effort. India was enough. So they wanted a way of outsourcing empire. If you find somebody like Hart who will run your trade systems for you in a way that you're somewhat familiar with, that's great. It's British overextension and Qing weakness that allows for that, for the customs service to emerge in between.
So the customs is much more than the story of Robert Hart, but he shaped it, and he instilled in the 11,000 men who came to work for the customs between 1854 and 1950 a strong ethos, a strong sense that they were Chinese civil servants. They worked for the Chinese government, not the British government or the French government or the Russian government. He didn't want men who were too well educated. He wanted men he could shape and mold. He also was a believer in the science of physiognomy. He believed that he could tell a man's character from his face. So he always wanted to see photographs of customs recruits, and he would reject people if he didn't like their photograph. He could damn you for life if he didn't like your face. Robert Hart also decided in 1868 that China needed a network of lighthouses along its coasts and along its major rivers. This is a fantastic achievement and a very difficult achievement as well. They were building these lights which had been fabricated in Paris or Birmingham, shipping them out to China, reassembling them in very remote spots.
So he uses his lighthouses and lightships and so on to collect data on the weather, on barometric pressures, on the state of the tide. And those are then brought together within China and are then made available to London as well. So that creates a globalization of that kind of knowledge.
Hart was also involved in the founding of a new postal service. A letter to his agent, James Campbell, in London, revealed his methods of recruiting and one of his private passions.
He realized he didn't have enough men to run it for him. So he asked Campbell to find the right person for him from London. And he laid down several criteria. For example, good handwriting, he has to be patient, painstaking, as well as sober and economical. But another important criteria was that person has to be able to play the first cornet and also arrange music for Hart's brass band in Beijing.
He recruited a Portuguese bandmaster. He sent to London for some uniforms and instruments and sheet music. And then they recruited some young Chinese boys and taught them to play some instruments. One can imagine how that sounded at start. Robert Hart's brass band became quite famous. It would play during garden parties in the Inspector General's residence in Beijing. And in time, other Chinese officials tried to poach people from his band or set up their own brass bands.
In 1900, war loomed again as anti-foreign feelings erupted in the Boxer Uprising.
The year before that had been bad harvests, so famines breaking out. And you have the emergence of anti-Christian Boxerish beliefs in a province near Beijing called Shandong. And they became very violent and they started murdering Christians. That led to a panic.
In June, seeing a chance to capitalize on the popular uprising against a foreign culture, the Qing government joined the Boxers in a bid to oust foreign power and influence from China. Eventually,
The crisis across China led to the legations in Peking and Robert Hart's Inspectorate General being besieged by Chinese forces and Boxers.
With communication impossible and the situation chaotic, the authorities in London feared the worst.
Hart was almost killed. St. Paul Cathedral was almost to hold a funeral for him, but luckily it was cancelled in the last minute.
The British and other foreign powers responded with an invasion of northern China, the defeat of the Boxers and of Qing forces, and the looting of Beijing.
The last hours of the siege were marked by the death of a gallant Frenchman, Captain Lefranc, and a German soldier who, just released from hospital with his first wounds healed, was shot dead an hour after.
And as soon as the siege was lifted, Robert Hart sent overseas his essays defending China and pleading for China not to be badly treated as a result.
This episode of Today is not meaningless. It is the prelude to a century of change. The China of the year 2000 will be very different from the China of 1900. National sentiment is a constant factor which must be recognised and not eliminated. And the one feeling that is universal in China is pride in Chinese institutions and contempt for foreign. Treaties have not altered this. If anything, they have deepened it, and the future will not be uninfluenced by it.
Over 100 years later, the Chinese Maritime Customs is one of the largest in the world, with its own unique historic archive of Hart's era as Inspector General.
中国近现代史的这样一个研究也有一定的很大的帮助。
当时的中国近代海关成为在中国政府机构中一个高效执法、廉洁这么一个部门。那么对于这个中国的这个近代化的这种管理，
我觉得在西方历史上受到重视与否，完全在于研究西方历史这个领域里面的人物所决定的。
相信随着经济全球化的不断的一个延伸，中国和西方世界的接触越来越多。其从过往中国和西方接触的一些经验中，尤其是从赫德身上，我们的确是可以学到很多的一些经验，用在今后的工作中。
Slowly, Robert Hart's contribution to China is coming to light.
那么现在呢，这个随着这个时代的进步和这个历史的这个档案资料的公布，那么特别从学术界来说呢，那么就是开始就是说对这一段历史呢，再重新回顾这一段历史。从历史的眼光看呢，他还是起了对于就是中国近代社会的发展，特别近代海关制度建立呢，起了重要的建设性作用。
In 1908, Hart finally returned to Britain. He continued to be active in Chinese affairs until his death in 1911, while staying near Bisham in Buckinghamshire. He was 76. Soon after, a statue was raised to him on the Bund in Shanghai to mark his contribution to China. The statue was removed during the Japanese occupation in 1943. The only memorial to Hart is not in China or his native island, but here in this churchyard by the River Thames. Today his grave is being restored by friends from all over the world in dedication to his life and work for China and Britain. His diaries, which miraculously escaped the destruction of the Boxer Uprising, provide a unique insight both into his personal life and the violent, turbulent, but always intimate relationship between Britain and China.
I sometimes shock my Chinese colleagues. For example, the other day, somebody asked me, so how do English people think about Robert Hart and the Chinese customs? And I said, they don't know anything about it. Most of them have never heard of Robert Hart. Here in China, that period of the century of national humiliation is taught from primary school through university. All young Chinese people know who I'm talking about when I talk about Robert Hart or I talk about the British enterprise in China. But in England, this is not taught within the history curriculum. And in fact, in many places, you can go through school without learning anything about China at all. Britain has always been more important in Chinese history than China has been important in British history.
He wanted to make Western powers to understand there was a big clash between Chinese civilization and the Western cultures. He didn't mean Chinese civilization was higher, better than Western civilizations. He just wanted to point out the difference between these two cultures, and perhaps the West should allow China to grow again at its own pace. This is one of the main principles Hart always insists.
I want to be useful and to do useful work. I don't care whether I am remembered or not, but I do desire to carry in my own heart the consciousness of having been of some use to my fellow man. Have I been of any use to them yet?